There were a lot of ways to die in the Old West. So many, in fact, that Seth MacFarlane made a really bad movie about them in 2014. A rattlesnake bite, you fall into a canyon, get killed by a gang of outlaws. But if you happened to be traversing eastern Kansas in the 1870s, you had to worry about serial killers too. Now, the term serial killer wouldn't be used until almost exactly 100 years later, but serial killers is exactly the term to apply to a family known as the Bloody Benders, who terrorized the American frontier. What's more, they got away with it, narrowly avoiding capture and then disappearing into legend, with so many possibilities for what happened to them that the primary concern someone should have when learning about them is vetting their sources.
It's a fun story full of Old West trappings in addition to the darkly attractive detective work of a true crime podcast. But what brought us into it was not only all of the fun, but also the fascinatingly terrifying prospect that we might be related to them. We're going to try not only to examine, but also to debunk as much information on the Bloody Benders as we can to make this a one-stop shop for the killers. Let's explore.
Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Jake, and we're both public high school teachers. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, authorizing American citizens to essentially get 160 acres of land for free on the American frontier, as long as they promised to live on and work the land, farming and ranching. Now, there's an obvious problem with this, being that there were already people living on that land. Specific to the area we're looking at, it was the Osage tribe, living in today's southeastern Kansas. The U.S. government forcibly moved the Osage people south to what would become the state of Oklahoma in the early 1870s. This was their third forced displacement in 46 years, and as you could probably anticipate, resulted in many deaths and a lot of hardship for the Osage people. And then, once in Oklahoma, there's a whole different set of things that would happen in the coming decades. Just read Killers of the Flower Moon.
Our area of interest is Labette County, Kansas, in the far southeast portion of the state. Labette County was home to a few cities and townships in the time, like Oswego, Independence, and Cherryvale, and had a population of about 9,000 distributed over the whole county in the 1870s. Cherryvale Township was located in the northeastern part of the county, and in October of 1870, two men appeared about 7 or 8 miles north of it and staked land claims for 160 acres. One man was young, the other old. Most likely father and son, and they were probably German or Dutch immigrants. They built a cabin on one of the parcels of land, the father's, about 100 yards away from the road. Even though he claimed the land at the land office in Humboldt, Kansas, the son never looks to have built anything on his tract or worked any part of his 160 acres at all. By the fall of the next year, two women joined them. Once again, one was young, one was old. These are the Benders. The four of them not only planted a large garden next to the cabin, but also planted an apple orchard on the property of at least 50 trees.
We found this wonderful little history book that was put together by the people of Labette County in the 1890s, and it simultaneously illuminated some things and obscured others, since it contradicted a lot of the other sources that we found. According to this history of the county, the cabin the Benders built was actually in Osage Township, on the road between the settlements of Osage Mission and Independence. Either way, it was about 16 feet by 24 feet in size and was divided in half by a wagon cover studded into the walls. The family hung a crude sign above the door reading "Groceries" and offered a few provisions for sale, as well as a place for travelers to sleep for the night, which, it turns out, was quite the mistake to take them up on.
This family was a group of spiritualists. Spiritualism was a new religious movement in the 19th century, a fad that mostly died out by the 1920s, and it was based on the belief that spirits of the dead not only exist, but have the ability and the desire to communicate with those in the living world. There were now 4 Benders living on the cabin in this homestead.
Did I just say living on this cabin in this homestead?
all of whom are pretty peculiar. The community knew almost nothing about them, but they were unfriendly, and sometimes attended community meetings or church services. Their inactivity in the community wasn't so much of a problem, seeing as everybody was busy trying to farm enough in order to, keep themselves and their families alive, but the family's behavior certainly raised eyebrows in the nearby townships. According to one source, they repelled rather than invited communication with their neighbors.
Pa Bender, perhaps the patriarch of the family, was probably named either John or William. Most of our sources list his name as John Sr., but that Labette County history book calls him William, as do some of the other assorted sites. We'll call him John Sr. or Pa for clarity, while acknowledging we're not 100% sure that was actually his real name. Now, John Sr. was about 60 years old and spoke almost no English, speaking so low and guttural that he could scarcely be understood. His German accent was thick and heavy. One book describes Pa: "This old man was repulsive, a hideous brute, without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered."
Ma Bender's identity is also obscured. Most sources list her name as Elvira, but it might also have been Elvia or Almira, so we'll stick with Elvira for consistency. Elvira was just a few years younger than Pa, and by all accounts was an awful, cruel person. Even though she apparently spoke no English at all, she was so mean to the people of Labette County that they called her a she-devil. Ma Bender was called a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell of murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth. So, nice people.
Now, the two younger family members were even weirder. John Jr. and Kate were both estimated to be in their mid-20s, with John Jr. probably being a little older, though there's some disagreement as to whether they were brother and sister or a husband and wife through common law marriage. It seems likely that they were a couple just posing as brother and sister for the ruse. Either way, they seem like they were sleeping together.
John Jr. was called handsome, but was also prone to laughing randomly, causing the townspeople to label him a half-wit. He spoke English fluently, but with a German accent. Young Bender, seen when excited, one source says, recalled the grave-robbing hyena at once to mind. Also, his real name might have been Gebhardt, but at least one Bender in this story has a consistent name: Kate.
Kate is definitely the most interesting of the Bender clan, and by some accounts was the brains of the operation. Kate professed to be a medium of spiritualism and conducted seances and lectures on the dead and the spirit world. There are even surviving ads for her lectures. Kate made some truly buck-wild claims, like she was friends with Napoleon Bonaparte, despite the French emperor dying 30 years before she was born. She also claimed to be a healer, using magical powers, but she, strangely enough, refused to collect a fee if her patient didn't recover, which seems oddly altruistic for a serial killer. And about 90 years before the hippies, Kate also allegedly practiced free love and eschewed any notion of sexual purity, leading her to be rather popular in town. You go, Kate. Gaslight gatekeep girl boss.
So we have an angry old unintelligible man, a she-devil of an old woman, a faith-healing hippie woman, and the Joker. Let's get to the murders.
So the Benders first arrived in 1870 and had their inn and grocery store set up by the following year. By May of 1871, the first murder that can be certainly attributed to them occurs southeast of the Bender store. In the nearby Drum Creek, the body of a man is found near the river. He's obviously been murdered, and this is important. The side of his skull has been bashed in, and his throat has been cut from ear to ear.
In February 1872, 2 more bodies were found along the Osage Trail, both of them having similar injuries: slashed throats and crushed skulls. It was difficult to ignore how many people in the area were disappearing. By autumn, so many travelers who had been expected in nearby towns or at Fort Scott had never arrived that people began to avoid traveling the Osage Trail. According to contemporary accounts, there were even some people trying to take the situation into their own hands. Several pirates traveled the road, making inquiries for persons who were missing or who had last been heard of at Fort Scott or Independence.
In 1873, following the death of his wife, George Newton Longcore, or possibly Launcher or Loucher, depending on the source, and his daughter Mary left Labette County for a family member's town in Iowa, but never made it. Some accounts list Mary as about 8 years old, but she might have been as young as a toddler. Dr. William Henry York, their former neighbor who had sold them a wagon and horses for the trip, was told that the wagon had been found abandoned near Fort Scott. Dr. York went to the site where he identified the wagon and horses that he had sold to Longcore and found clothing fitting both an adult man and a little girl. On his way back to Independence, Kansas, Dr. York stopped at the Bender Inn for the night. He never made it back home.
On or about March 10th, 1873, the people of Labette County held a meeting at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse to talk about herding, but the numerous missing persons and the suspicions of who could be at fault were brought up. Both John Sr. and John Jr. were in attendance at the schoolhouse. Some blamed the Osage tribe, others weren't so sure, but it seems that everyone was thirsty for some frontier justice, and the town talked of hangings. When one community member apparently volunteered to commence the search at my house, and another man said, yes, and go directly from there to my house, Pa Bender, who sat between them, said nothing. While the county was eager to comb the area for evidence of foul play, some bad weather delayed the search for a while.
Unfortunately for the Benders, their victim, Dr. William Henry York, was from a prominent Kansas family that included a state senator. Dr. York's brother, Colonel Ed York, organized a search party in April to try to find his missing brother. Colonel York's search even brought him to the cabin of the Benders, who denied any knowledge of the crime. However, Colonel York was suspicious of the Benders and returned to their cabin with armed men. He questioned them about a woman who claimed to have fled the Bender Inn after Elvira threatened her with knives and pistols. Even though Elvira had pretended not to understand English, at this point she flew into a violent passion and began yelling in English about how that woman had cursed her coffee. Kate offered to use her psychic abilities to help Colonel York search for his brother if he returned alone. The search party left.
It seems like the Bender family left their home that night for Humboldt, Kansas, purchasing either northbound or westbound tickets for the 5 a.m. train. In early May, Labette County locals noticed that the Benders' animals were either dead or starving. Township officer Leroy Dick noted that the property apparently was abandoned, and there was an odor coming from the cabin. He called for a host of men who brought shovels and pickaxes.
The property had indeed been abandoned for some time. Found within the Bender cabin was a trap door, clumsily hidden under a bed, closed using a leather strap, and nailed shut. Underneath the trap door, the men found a space large enough for an adult body to fall through, and the walls of the hovel were covered in dried blood. The cellar was obviously where the hideous smell was coming from, but when that yielded no bodies, the search party began to dig up the vegetable garden, where they quickly found Dr. York in a grave so shallow that his heels were scarcely covered by the dirt. Over the next 2 days, 10 bodies had been found in the garden and the apple orchard, along with a few other dismembered body parts. All were found with similar injuries, smashed skulls and slit throats, except for one, who was apparently buried alive.
The Bloody Benders killed a minimum of 12 people, but the count was likely higher than that due to random body parts being found at the scene, with a possible total of 21 different victims. The remains of George Longcore and his daughter were found, as well as several other remains listed here.
Based on the physical evidence and the survivor stories, it appears that guests were given the seat of honor at the dinner table, in front of the wagon cover partition. Their seat was positioned over the trap door. While eating, one of the men would come from behind the wagon cover and bash them in the side of the head with a hammer, while one of the women would then slit their throat to ensure that the victim was dead. The body would then be dropped, Sweeney Todd style, into the cellar space, where they would wait till nightfall when it could be stripped, dismembered, and then buried. A dozen bullet holes were also found in the cabin, likely just from victims fighting back. Because most of the Bender victims were just homesteaders traveling with nothing but the supplies that they could carry, the consensus seems to be that the Benders killed for fun and not for the loot.
A few of their would-be victims apparently declined to sit at the seat in front of the curtain, an action that would cause the Benders to become inhospitable and even threatening. That shift in attitude caused a man named Wetzel and his traveling companion to leave right then and there. A man named Pickering told investigators an almost identical story, both men whose discomfort probably saved their lives.
As the Benders' victims were unearthed, word spread quickly, and hundreds of thrill seekers descended on the cabin, gathering souvenirs as they could be found. The entire cabin was hauled away, one stick of wood at a time, until nothing remained. Because of this mad dash, it's hard to figure out what truly happened to the contents of the cabin, or even where it actually stood. Several stores and museums in the last 140 years have claimed to have the hammers that the family used against their victims, or the knife that Kate used to cut their throats. Cherryvale, Kansas has a room in their local museum dedicated to Benders, where they claim to display the murder weapon hammers, though the glass is apparently fogged from the years.
A Lutheran hymnal was found in the cabin, though, and it included notes written in German, which were later translated. If your family is Lutheran or of German descent, this might sound familiar. Keeping birth and death dates recorded in the front or back pages of a Bible was pretty common. It's something our family did too.
Most of the inscriptions in the hymnal are illegible, but a few can be read, including Johanna Bender, born July 30, 1848, John Gerhardt or Gebhardt came to America on July 1, 18-something, and Big Slaughter Day, January 8th, hell departed, apparently denoting a day in which the Benders killed more than one person and predicted the afterlife circumstances of one of their victims. After the cabin was thoroughly picked through, Kansas State Senator Alexander York offered a reward of $1,000 for each of the Benders captured, a total reward that would be valued at nearly $150,000 today. Kansas Governor George T. Anthony chipped in another $2,000, bringing the reward to almost $100,000 per Bender found. The rewards were never claimed. The people of Labette never got the hangings they were hoping for. So where did they go?
Honestly, it's really hard to tell what's true and what's just frontier myth. You might think the next step is easy. Just find more murders that match the MO of the Benders, and a link is created. Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Quite a few crimes committed in the last decades of the 1800s bear an almost close enough resemblance without being dead ringers that the trail could quite literally lead anywhere west of Labette County, Kansas. According to Labette County's history book from the 1890s, the Benders might have split up and taken different trains away from home. John Sr. and Elvira going to St. Louis, and John Jr. and Kate heading toward Oklahoma Territory and possibly reuniting in Texas or New Mexico. However, this led to a dead end in our research. We just couldn't find any other historical evidence that shows that this was the way they went. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it certainly makes it harder to determine if it's true.
In 1884, an elderly man matching Pa Bender's description was arrested in Montana for a murder committed near Salmon, Idaho, where the victim had been killed by, can you guess? A hammer blow to the head. The old man was never positively identified as Pa Bender because he severed his own foot to escape the leg irons and bled to death once he escaped. Because he was already dead, authorities never corresponded with Cherryvale, Kansas police to get an identification. Despite the lack of a positive ID, the man's skull was displayed as that of Pa Bender in a salmon saloon until Prohibition forced the closure in 1920, and the skull disappeared.
The Benders might not have even been a family. A couple of sites we've read claim that they weren't a biological family unit, but just playing one, with both the Bender men perhaps having been born in Holland or Germany, but from different families. Pa was perhaps John Flickinger, and John Jr. might have been John Gebhardt. The women might have been from the Adirondack Mountains region of the U.S. with the real last name of Meek. This same site claims that Kate's real name might have been Sarah Eliza Davis or Eliza Griffith, and that she was potentially the fifth child of Elvira's 12 children. Another one says that Almira Griffith and her daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Griffith, were arrested in Michigan in 1889, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the Benders, and were even positively identified in Oswego, but the two were acquitted. The alleged Kate Bender produced a marriage certificate from Michigan from 1872, proving that she couldn't have been in Kansas in the time of the killings. The jurors dismissed the case, saying they were certain the identities were wrong, but some doubt hovers over that conclusion. Various investigators claim Labette County might just not have wanted to foot the bill for housing and feeding the two women for an extended period of time during a trial. Also, I guess this theory holds that Pa, actually John Flickinger, committed suicide at Lake Michigan.
There are also a few stories of the Benders being killed in prairie violence by either bandits or specific vigilante justice parties who sought them out, throwing their bodies into the Verdigris River before the police could come, or burned Kate alive. But the fact remains that the reward for their capture was never claimed. A series of letters from a book called Celebrated Criminal Cases of America claims the Benders found the end of a rope at the hands of Labette County residents.
Cherryvale, Kansas, June 14th, 1910. Dear Sir, yours just received. It so happened that my father-in-law's farm joins the Bender farm, and he helped locate the bodies of the victims. I often tried to find out from him what became of the Benders, but he only gave me a knowing look and said he guessed they would not bother anyone else. There was a vigilance committee organized to locate the Benders, and shortly afterward, Old Man Bender's wagon was found by the roadside, riddled with bullets. You will have to guess the rest. I am, respectfully yours, J.N. Kramer, Chief of Police.
Independence, Kansas, June 14th, 1910. Dear Sir, in regard to the Bender family, I will say that I have lived here 40 years, and it is my opinion that they never got away. A vigilance committee was formed, and some of them are still here, but will not talk except to say that it would be useless to look for them, and they smiled at the reports of some of the family having been located. The family nearly got my father. He intended to stay there one night, but he became suspicious, and although they tried to coax him to stay, he hitched up his team and left. Regretting that I cannot give you more information, I am yours respectfully, D. M. Van Cleve, Chief of Police.
Over the next decades, with no justice coming out of the bizarre series of murders, the Bender story spread. It was common for mothers and daughters traveling to be accused of being the Bender women, and in fact, a decent number of women were arrested and charged with being Elvira and Kate over the next few decades, but none of them were ever convicted.
In 1910, a woman in San Francisco made a deathbed confession that she had secretly been living a double life, but was actually Kate Bender. That story was picked up all over the West, including here in the Montrose Daily Press on Colorado's western slope. But all of this is just conjecture. If you're lost right now, that's okay. We are too. We're really not sure what to believe. None of these aforementioned stories are airtight. Nobody truly knows the full story of what happened to the Benders.
Family photos have been circulated claiming to be photos of the Benders, but almost none of them have a solid origin and probably are not the Benders. If you Google the Bloody Benders, several different images are offered up as a possible depiction of Pa, but it's hard to tell where these come from. This one, at least, is the same artist as these other three, drawn by John Towner James for the book The Benders in Kansas in 1913. And this set of both Pa and Ma Bender comes from a book called History, Romance, and Philosophy of Great American Crimes and Criminals. But we couldn't find what they were based on. It's anyone's guess as to where this last one comes from.
When we first heard the story of the Bloody Benders a couple of years ago, we brought it up to our grandmother, who not only grew up in southeastern Kansas, but has family with the last name of Bender. Much to our surprise, she had heard this story. She knew this story very well, and told us that our family had sometimes wondered, are we descended from the Bloody Benders?
Okay, this got weird fast. Our grandmother not only knew the story of the Bloody Benders because she grew up in the same area, but she told us that in childhood, she and her mother had been accused of being Elvira and Kate at times because the legend had just become so ingrained in that part of the country. I mean, Our grandmother was born in 1932, so the timeline doesn't make any sense at all, but we thought it was wild that it happened, and it happened more than once. At least some of our family is from southeastern Kansas, but there were a few other coincidences as well. The Benders spoke a guttural German or Dutch that was tough to understand. We're inclined to think that it was more likely a German language, because especially things like contemporary sources, such as the proclamation calling for their capture and posting, the rewards say German rather than Dutch. Our family spoke a weird dialect of German, Volgadeutsch, that was very hard to understand, and our family didn't even stop speaking German as a first language until the 1930s. We come from Lutheran farmers, and the Benders were farmers with apparent Lutheran ties. John, Gerhardt, and Kate are all names that you can find all over our family tree. Not to mention, the last name Bender.
While it's hard to tell where the Benders ended up after leaving Labette County, there seems to be as much evidence for them landing in Colorado as there is anywhere else. True West magazine makes an interesting case that Katie Bender, at least, ended up in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, about 2.5 hours west from us along Interstate 70. That further confounded things for us, because the Katie Bender in that grave might have had the maiden name of Miller, which is another last name from our family tree.
Additionally, if one were to take train tickets from St. Louis, like the Benders might have, one of the likely destinations was along the Santa Fe Trail to the town of La Junta, which was a large train depot at the time. A lot of our family resides in the La Junta area. We know that different branches of our family arrived in Colorado between the 1880s and about the 1920s, so the timing lines up as well. Deciding that it couldn't hurt to try, we reached out to Susan Jonas's, who's writing a book about the Bloody Benders called Hell's Half Acre, The Untold Story of the Benders, a serial killer family on the American frontier. Sounds great, right? We reached out on Twitter. After pre-ordering her book, we asked if she was able to track the Benders after about 1873. She was able to uncover their movements for a while, but only up until about 1877. She was of the opinion that they ended up in southeastern Colorado.
So we decided to go either debunk or confirm the idea that we might be related to our Old West killers. Jake gets free access to some ancestry sites through the library system in South Denver, so we headed to the Lone Tree Library to build a family tree. Quick plug for libraries, by the way. There's so much more than a place to check out books these days, and you should definitely pop into your local branch to see what they've got. Librarians are pretty much miracle workers, and if you haven't got an active library card, you might seriously be missing out on some cool stuff.
We've been doing this show for like a year, and this is the first time we've ever been in a show together.
We wanted to find out if we were related, but we also wanted to uncover whatever we could about the Benders in the process. Here was our methodology. We began searching a slew of ancestry and record sites for the Benders, one member at a time, making allowance for the fact that birth dates were estimated, and we tried all of the assumed names. For example, we looked for John Bender Jr., born sometime within 5 years of 1845 in Germany, but then we also searched for John Gebhardt, John Gerhardt, John Gebert, widened the window for birth year, and then dropped the European birth requirement. We went through each family member and then searched criminal records for each of the crimes committed by the possible Benders after 1873. And that yielded kind of nothing. There were very few recorded crimes that we could find by people with those names in those time periods. We found a different William Bender who committed various crimes and did time in both Sing Sing and San Quentin. And we love the hell out of these old-timey mugshots, but he was obviously not one of our Benders.
So after going to the library, building a family tree, calling our dad, and having our aunt, who lives in the same town as some relatives with the last name of Bender, talk to them and build something of a clear idea of who was born where and when, we can say with some certainty, no, we're not related to the Bloody Benders. We figured that we would need to trace our family tree back from our great-uncle Alvin Bender to his parents born in the early 1910s, and then to his grandparents, Jacob J. Bender and Eva E. Bender, who were born in the 1870s. This is where it becomes clear that there is no relation. Since the Benders arrived in Labette County in 1870 and were actively killing by 1871 with no reports of a baby present, that couldn't be Jacob. And even though Eva was born in 1876 after the Benders disappeared, we're almost certain that Bender is just her married name, so she wasn't a Bender by birth.
We really don't mind that we didn't find the connection, though. We got to explore a lot of really cool things about our own family history and trace back some genealogy all the way to Russia in the 1740s. That part was just really fun. We've also gained the confidence that unless some absolutely devastating piece of evidence is uncovered that blows this whole thing wide open, or someone has access to research tools outside of the reach of a normal person, I don't think anyone's ever going to discover where the Benders went, simply because Bender was such a common name in the West. Using the ancestry indexes at our library, or even just one of those Find a Grave websites, searching for graves with the name Bender in just Colorado yields so many results. We couldn't even keep track of how many we found here in Kansas, Montana, Idaho, California, and Utah. What makes things even harder is that names were often Americanized when a person immigrated to the US in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So Johann became John, Wilhelm became William, Katerina became Catherine, and so on, until your net has to get even wider.
The Katie Bender that True West magazine identified seemed like the strongest case before we delved into it, because she is of the right origin and born in the exact right time. But there were so many Kate Benders that we found that it appears to be just a coincidence that she shares the name and birth year that we're looking for. Additionally, we couldn't find any record of her spiritualism teachings in Glenwood Springs, and she appears to have been a valuable, beloved member of the community, just owning that restaurant, so it doesn't really fit.
Our nugget of hope that we have left is that we did find 2 immigration records, one for a Johann Bender and the other for a W. Bender, both born about 1812 in Germany. They arrived in the US in 1846 and 1851 respectively, so it's a tenuous connection, but it was kind of cool to think that we just might be looking at Pa Bender's immigration records prior to the murders.
What we're really doing here is we're looking for one specific straw of hay in a 150-year-old haystack. 4 specific people named Bender amongst tens of thousands when we don't even really know what they looked like, what their names were, where they were from, or how long they lived. After all this research, I gotta hand it to you, Bloody Benders. It was the perfect crime.
Today, there's a historical marker at the Bender Mounds, which are near the site of the Labette County cabin. They were sold in February of 2020, along with 14 other tracts of land for just over $2 million. As with much of the rest of the heart of the US, not a whole lot has changed since the 1870s, as they're primarily used for farming soybeans and ranching. In fact, the Wells Fargo executive who currently owns the Bender Mounds bought them because he's interested in the killings and hopes to do some professional investigation into where the cabin exactly stood.
The Benders have been depicted in everything from Little House on the Prairie to Supernatural to Red Dead Redemption 2, so they've been comfortably mythologized. The book we mentioned before, Hell's Half Acre, comes out next month, and we're really looking forward to reading a more authoritative source on the Benders that'll shed some light in the corners of the cabin that we haven't been able to discover yet, especially if they had the resources to fact-check the absolute miasma of information that seems to be out there about the family.
So where we fit into this story is not as descendants to the Benders, as the endpoint of a long-lost trail picked up by some one-time genealogist, but as 2 people trying to figure out some meaning in a historical mystery. We can only hope that someone adds to the work that's already out there and is able to make connections that we weren't. Until then, we'll see you in the history books.